Hey, everybody. Welcome to another edition of Full Exposure with me, your host, Brian Kelly. It's episode 16, and today's guest is Kevin Buist, who is the artistic director of ArtPrize. But before we get into Kevin's episode, I have a major announcement. And I'm so excited to announce that we have our first podcast partner who's helping to underwrite a lot of content over the coming 12 months. And I'm just so pleased to announce that Metro Health, University of Michigan Health, and Dr. Peter Hahn are going to be our first podcast partner. I could have not asked for a better partnership. It really is an incredible opportunity that they've provided to me. Metro Health and their affiliation with the University of Michigan Health, they're doing incredible things in the West Michigan community. And I, again, could not be more pleased with this association with them. And I just can't wait for the next year as things roll out and you become more familiar with Metro Health, University of Michigan Health. And special thanks to Dr. Peter Hahn, who is their newer CEO, I guess. He's been there a little over a year. And is really an innovator, a bright thinker. He thinks differently about healthcare. He's a physician. Metro Health, University of Michigan Health is a physician-led organization, which is rare sometimes. Sometimes it's just an administrator. But having somebody who's a practicing doctor also leading the organization is something quite incredible to have right here in West Michigan. So with that, we'll get started on talking about Kevin Buist, who is the artistic director at ArtPrize and Project One. Kevin and I go back quite a ways. I started working with ArtPrize even before its inception, sort of thinking about photography and some things that they might need during the very first ArtPrize. And Kevin was the artistic director back then and artist relations person. And I really admired him, and I watched him for a long time over the last 10 years handle all kinds of situations, including some controversies, and there's one going on right now with Project One. We talk about it in the podcast with Disart, which is an organization that is arranged a performance that has created some controversy in town, and we touch base on that. Although, as a caveat, we did talk, this podcast was recorded about 2.5 weeks ago or 2 weeks ago, and details were just evolving. So, but I really learned from Kevin over the years, and I think you'll enjoy this conversation. Project One is a very ambitious project. ArtPrize is now biennial. And this year it's morphed into this Project One. And you can see it all across Grand Rapids from September 7 to October 27, 2019. And Kevin, along with other leadership, has been at the forefront of planning this huge scale event. It encompasses 3 locations and 5 artists around the city. And Kevin has curated it. He came up with the theme of crossed lines, which we dive into in depth in the podcast. And you'll get a preview of what each site and each artist is doing at each site. But you should check it out. You know, with ArtPrize going biennial, that means the ArtPrize we've known and to come and to know and love over the last 10 years is taking a break. But in its place, ArtPrize has along with Kevin, spearheading this curation, created just pretty spectacular commissions. So amazing art to see at 3 different locations around the city. And so I hope you get out and see it. It starts this weekend, September 7th. That's Saturday. It's just a couple days away. So you need to get out there, get your ArtPrize fix, and get at it. My conversation with Kevin Buist, artistic director of ArtPrize. The Full Exposure podcast is made possible by Metro Health, University of Michigan Health, and Dr. Peter Hahn in appreciation for the contributions that artists and creative minds provide to our community. Arts and culture are essential to a rich and rewarding life, strengthening our overall well-being and our appreciation of all that we see, hear, and experience. Kevin Buist, literally take 2.
Take 2.
Take 2. The story was
It hasn't changed. In the past, you came in and we had the most amazing conversation.
Are you adapting
of
this,
all time?
Are you editing this story? Are you adapting it? Are you going to tell the full truth?
We're putting a positive yarn on it.
Yeah.
How about that? We'll
All
pull
right.
up my Irish roots. We're spinning a good yarn.
Good.
No, you came in. We had a lovely conversation.
This
did a photo shoot.
was 2 or 3 months ago, right?
Yeah,
the
it was
beginning
like
of the
probably
summer?
May or June.
I think so.
It was May or early June.
Yeah.
And I thought we put out the podcast pretty quick. And then I recorded 2 podcasts in one day, which I always try to do 2 in a day if I can, because it takes a while to get the machine going and the lighting up and everything going. And so I recorded 2, and just a week or 2 later, I went back to revisit our audio, and I had basically it sounded like this the entire conversation for an hour.
Yeah.
And
That's
I
always
was
what you want to hear. That's a really great
I was
sign.
like, man, I don't remember Kevin's
that-
voice quite being like that.
Just that minimal.
No.
white
Just for the
white
audience,
noise.
there was a stupid little button on this control mixer that prevented it from exporting to my computer in real time. So I exported something, but it didn't have our words.
No, the words are important. And you you told me
This is what I've learned.
it was in June, I think, and you told me that it would be coming out in like a week or 2. And you'd recorded another one that day, so you're like, that one might come out first, and then it'll be yours. And you kind of told me the schedule that you're doing it, and I was like, okay, cool, and I was excited. And I even told people that I work with. I didn't tell a ton of people.
Yeah.
Because I was like, I don't want to post on social media about this until I can post the
Right.
episode, right?
Sure,
Like it
sure.
would just be weird to be like, wait for this. But at least people who I work with, I was like, oh,
you had to
I'm
explain why
excited.
you were out at the office.
Yeah, I was like, this is what I'm going to go do today, and I'm excited about it. And then so the weeks just wore on. From this date, and you kept releasing all these episodes, and they were really cool. And every time a new one would come out, I'd be like, oh, I'd get like, I would be like, oh,
Is it me?
That's a really,
Is it?
that's
Wait.
a really good portrait, and oh man. And then,
Well-
and I really did a lot of mental gymnastics. I'm ashamed to say, but I will admit it. Of like, why? 'Cause
No.
I was like, I was going back
sorry.
through my head, and I was like, what did I say? Like, what did I say that when he played it back, he was like, fuck this guy. I'm not putting him on. Or
There was
I
a lot
think-
of saying "fuck this guy," but I was referring to myself because I was such an idiot.
It did occur to me that it was a possibility that was like a technical thing, and I was like, if he has to take a little time before he can
I
admit
let it breathe.
that's okay.
I
Just let
did.
it
I
breathe.
was so humiliated. I mean, I hate wasting anybody's time, and the fact I wouldn't, if the situation had been reversed,
Yeah.
I mean, now I would be like, oh yeah, you know what, stuff happens, Kevin.
Yeah.
Let's just, don't
Yeah.
worry about it. Which you've been great and gracious with your time to come back again, but part of me is just like, oh really? Come on.
Yeah.
Like this is so dumb. But I am new to the podcasting game, and I like to say it is a game.
It's a game.
We're on the playing field right now.
I get it though. I mean, I don't much anymore, but I did some audio production and video production.
You used to
and
have a podcast.
And
yeah.
I had a podcast a long time ago, and my dad had his whole career doing photography and video, and he would tell me these horror stories about shooting an entire wedding with the lens cap on. He had like some kind of a viewfinder camera.
Oh yeah, it didn't look through the lens.
Where you could, it was like
went
a
through the side.
It
It
was like a thing where when you're
rangefinder.
rangefinder, when you this is in the 70s, where you're framing it up without actually looking through the lens.
Yep.
And he realized it before.
Can you imagine?
The wedding party had
That's-
dispersed, and so he was like,
mean-
"I'm really sorry. Everybody, get back together and do it again."
It just reminds me, after 22 years, you're never done learning, and you're never done making mistakes.
Yeah.
Which kind of brings us to our, not that you have mistakes, but
Oh,
the
I
point
do.
of like what I love about ArtPrize and your role there. And I want to jump into that. We're going to meander around a bit.
Yeah,
And I
totally.
want to talk about Project One a lot too,
Yep.
because it's such a big shift for ArtPrize as an organization. But I've always admired you. What is your title? Director of Artist Relations, and now you're like curator.
Artistic director is my title now. Yeah.
Yeah, and that encompasses artists, and it encompasses curation,
Yeah.
and just general knowledge of the art world.
Yeah, it
and
looks-
what's contemporary right now.
It looks different in kind of ArtPrize years and project years, as we're calling them, because we announced this thing last summer where ArtPrize is switching to a biennial format. So the ArtPrize competition that we know and love is continuing, but it will happen every other year on even numbered years. And then this year, for 2019, we're doing a new thing called Project One, which is still a huge public art exhibition, but it's different in a couple ways because it's not a competition. Instead, we're commissioning just a small handful of artists, but each of those artists is creating a project that's so enormous and so involved that we could never support it during the ArtPrize competition. So it gives us a chance to...
And they wouldn't necessarily be able to undertake it as a single entry themselves because of other costs and site logistics, and they really needed your expertise to pull out Project One.
Yeah.
That collaboration between a great idea by a particular artist that's under the umbrella. We'll talk about the theme for this year later, but just the point of there had to be a collision with some commissioning dollars to really make it go.
Which is huge for me because I've been a part of ArtPrize since the beginning, so we've done it 10 times, and in that time we've done some amazing stuff that I'm really proud of the work. But there's always been this kind of next level of public art projects that we just can never quite get to.
Yes.
Because we weren't set up really to provide support up front. The whole thing was backloaded into this. There's this giant carrot on a stick, and it's this prize, and and that animates so much creative activity, which is great, which is why it's not going away because it is successful. But we were like, what if we just alternated and front load the thing every other year so that we can find the right artists who are doing just incredible work all over the world, and then really help them realize a project in Grand Rapids in the sort of continuing context of the ArtPrize tradition.
Yes.
Which I think is important because Grand Rapids is a very unique place, and it presents a lot of unique opportunities. And the momentum that we built with ArtPrize presents a lot of unique public art opportunities that don't exist in places that are bigger or smaller. It's pretty unique to what we have.
I want to ask you a question. It's related to what we're talking about, but it's sort of a sidebar. I'll divert us for a second. But you've traveled the world now a lot with ArtPrize and going to biennials in Venice, and you travel quite a bit. I'm always amazed how much you're on the road when it's not ArtPrize season.
Yeah.
But we're talking about Grand Rapids, and I wonder, did you grew up in Grand Rapids?
I did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I grew up here too, but you begin as you get older to get a little more of a perspective of what the city is and sort of that culture that's here, whatever that makes us us.
Yeah.
Or in some respects, do you have a better handle of like the fly on the wall sort of perspective of what Grand Rapids is from your own? Like you mentioned what's unique. You said Grand Rapids is so unique. So what is it that's different than Miami? It's different than Italy. And I don't mean like cross-cultural, different languages, but maybe just, is there something, two or three things that's like Grand Rapids is this?
It's hard because I'm in my love-hate relationship with Grand Rapids. The last few days it's been strained, which is a whole other thing. But no, I mean, I think that there's this kind of like Protestant industriousness here.
Hard workers.
Yeah,
right?
Hard workers. There's like there is this sort of Michigan Rust Belt mentality of industry, but I think it's more design. It has more of a design pedigree.
Yeah.
With the furniture industry, not that the auto industry doesn't have a design component, but at least culturally, it's just more associated with questions of labor and things like that. Whereas, and not that doesn't exist here, but there's this design, with Kendall and with these big furniture manufacturers, and I think that does make a difference. I don't know. It's funny.
It's kind of in that whatever. It's kind of like with that DNA thing. You can't really change, but like we talked about, even being at the airport, and sometimes I know which gate is mine. As if I'm flying to Grand Rapids, connecting into Grand Rapids, I could just look at the people waiting in that area without looking at where that gate's going.
Yeah.
And I know it's going to Grand Rapids.
Yeah. Oh, and the other ones are different altogether. Like
totally.
when you go through those things and it's like all the regional flights going out, like that one's going to Little Rock.
That one's going to Oklahoma because there's a couple guys with 10-gallon hats on.
Yeah, totally.
And then here it's like there's a
more or less
look.
stereotypical.
Yeah.
No, in the traveling I've done to other cities, I've been to a lot of other big cities, but also other mid-sized cities and things like that. And I remember for some reason, it was like I took these 2 trips, and they're for different reasons, but one was to Minneapolis and one was to Dallas. And I was talking with people and having these meetings around stuff we were working on in those places. And I had this similar situation in both cities where it was like people talked about the city almost the way that they would talk about a sibling.
Yeah.
And they're kind of like if I haven't seen your brother in a long time, like, what is he up to? Yeah. And you have to you think for a second till you have to be like, okay, I have to somehow say he got divorced, but I also have to brag about his new job, and I have to,
there's this measurement.
There's this measurement to where they're trying to be like, I am proud of it and I do want to boost it, but I also like have to, how do I tactfully acknowledge
How do we
the
warn
crap,
people of the underbelly of
the
whatever it is
crap that we're
bugs you?
stuck in and that we can't deal with and we don't know why, and so there's this weird kind of measured way that people talk about their own cities.
Yeah.
And I feel that about Grand Rapids and sometimes I'm put in these situations where I have to kind of be a booster around it, but I always try to be measured. I try to be honest about it and be like, I think this is a great place, but
no place is for everybody and no place is, perfect. I think we put certain cities because we don't spend a lot of time there on a pedestal.
Yeah.
And when you're visiting, you're seeing the best parts. You're living at a standard that you wouldn't normally live. You're going to eat in restaurants or go out and experience nightlife on a level that you would not do day to day if you live there. So, the commute becomes part of the drudgery of it, and your ignorant neighbors are another thing, and other inspiring people are another part of it.
And I totally think that living in a city and visiting a city are two totally different things. Like I lived in New York for a period, and I visit there probably twice a year or more now, for the past a long time. And so I love going to New York, and I have a good familiarity with it, and I can get around easily. And it's like public transportation and whatever else is not intimidating to me because I from living there for a little while, I get it. And I'm just like, man, this is the best place to visit and the worst place to live. Like I don't want to have to navigate.
I feel
how to do this more
I
than
feel the
like
same
3
way about
days.
LA. I feel the same way about a lot of bigger cities that I love to. I live over my budget. I'm there usually for work or whatever. I wouldn't do the things that I would normally do, and also the experiences feel fresh. You're stimulated by audio, audio, visual. You're taking it in. I often am reminded like how flat my own mind's eye my perception of Grand Rapids and West Michigan is, and Michigan in general. It's super flat. Mm-hmm. And then I'm looking, sometimes I actually do this as an exercise sometimes. Maybe it's more from a photography perspective. It's like, what if I just opened my eyes and this was a city and I didn't know anything about it? Well, then the elevation takes a little different scale.
Yeah.
The buildings take a little different scale. I try to see some things occasionally. It's a fun little exercise to try sometimes. It never fully works because you're always like, yeah, that's the building there. And that's where I was 21 and went out and had too much fun and whatever it might be. But I wanted to get back to ArtPrize because I have a long history with ArtPrize since before its inception, actually, and became photographer and then a videographer creating content for each year of ArtPrize through the first 10 years. Yeah. And what I was talking about mistakes earlier when we were talking just to open it was that ArtPrize has always been this radically open, decentralized catalyst. Mm-hmm. And all the
buzzwords.
Yeah, thank you. I read your,
there are words.
Yeah,
there are buzzwords. I mean,
that's where I look. That's where
but I think about them differently now than I did 10 years ago.
Well, I remember the chaotic storm that happened with the first ArtPrize. It was truly, if you could have created a phenomenon in every context of that word, where everyone was unexpectedly blown away by how many people came. Our cities were full. Restaurants ran out of food. Like, how many have you ever gone to a city where the restaurants are like, sorry, we can't open tomorrow because it's Sunday and we can't get food delivery. So there's nothing happening, and there's 80,000 people or 60 downtown on a Sunday, and they couldn't be open for business. Yeah. But out of that was all this between your artist relations and things. There was a lot of blowback. There was a lot of like vitriol directed back at ArtPrize. Some of it, on balance, it was. But you have been the point person for most of this heat. And if there's one thing I admire about you over the last 10, 11 years, is through the vitriol, you are able to sort of duck and weave and find the heart of what ArtPrize can learn from whatever this person's upset by, even though they're not approaching their words in a constructive manner. Yeah. You've been a master at that, and I don't know if you can speak to anything, because if I could learn one thing from you, it would be to not that you didn't take things personal, but you didn't personalize the feedback.
Yeah. That is hard. That is really hard. I mean, especially when it first started, there was this period of time, which looking back, it's only a couple months, but boy, it seemed like longer than that, between when we announced what we were doing and how it was all going to work,
Yeah.
and when the thing actually happened, right? That was a crazy time because it's the artist registration period, and it's the venues are signing up, and all of this sort of press is happening around, like, what's this thing going to be?
Yeah.
And we were figuring it out as we went along. Like we developed it very quickly.
Talk about a startup. Holy
Yeah.
cow.
We started developing it internally in January of 2009. We announced it publicly in late April, and then it opened in September. So it was that fast. And so, and a lot of that time was just the nuts and bolts of building a website which could support this artist registration process, and then of course the public vote, and deliver that with integrity and whatever else. But people, the public conversation around it at the time, there were artists who were just like, this will not work. Mm-hmm. They would just like swear up and down, and talk to any reporter that they could, and comment under any Facebook thing. And this is back when all of the news sites had comment sections, and sometimes people still read them because it was this other era of the internet where we thought like Web 2.0 and everyone has their voice, and everyone's really like optimistic about it, which plays into what ArtPrize is as well. But there were people, not everybody, but there were a loud minority of people who were like, this is a terrible idea. It's not going to work.
And you're ruining the art world.
Yes.
And this really was down to a lot of academics were upset that, the public wasn't given more artistic art history and background about what should be valued enough to win such an enormous prize. At the time, it was $250,000 for the winner, and there was large cash prizes for second and third place as well. Actually, through the whole top 10.
Yeah, back
at
then,
that time. Mm-hmm. So there was a lot of upheaval, a lot of discussion about who gets to control the narrative about what is art and what isn't, and that was like kind of once you got through the spectacle of this enormous cash prize as a catalyst, that was like my fifth thought I thought about, really. I didn't really think about this is going to make the art world horrible and no one's going to...
Right.
I mean, we're talking about a fairly narrow band of conversation. There were certainly many artists who were gung-ho and on it and produced work that they never would have as an entry to compete.
Yeah.
But that sort of blowback and being able to sort of, like I said earlier, just to duck and weave, but really listen to what was really being said and address it as an organization, because I think every year you've tweaked and done little things. Some of it has been big, some of it hasn't been.
Yeah.
You've added curators, you've done all kinds of things.
Yeah, well, I mean, to go back to that point about balancing what critics, and by critics I mean people who are critical of our approach, what they say about it, and the kind of like attacks that we underwent, especially in those early days. It's difficult because it's like there's this instinct where you just want to be combative and be like, I'll show you, you're so wrong, whatever. And I have to admit that there's something a little satisfying about the fact that they were wrong. It did work.
Right.
Like people older than me and people with, by all measures, more experience than me, swore up and down that it would be a colossal failure, and it wasn't. Like people really liked it.
Well, it was enormous. They might not have liked.
Well, it might not
the
have
meandering sort of like outcomes of things, but like in terms of as an experiment, as
right.
The
There's different definitions of success, but for what we were trying to do, it was successful.
Yeah.
So, but it's difficult to balance out. Do you just be like haters gonna hate and just like shut that out of your mind? But then at the same time, I always tried, even if it wasn't in the moment, at least with later reflection, to try to figure out like people they have a point, and some of that criticism early on was not just about like why you have the public vote, like they
don't know anything.
Yeah, the public doesn't get to vote on my brain surgery, or like, but there was other thing that people would say, which I think stuck a little bit more. Is the idea that artists need to be supported, right? Like, like prizes are one thing, but like production needs to be supported.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what we're doing. That's what we're doing with Project One. That's entirely what Project One is. But even before we made this switch, like for the past several years, we've introduced more and more grant programs.
Yeah, up front, and that's to like help. Like they submitted an idea, they needed. There were $5,000 sort of catalysts, and
there are a bunch of different levels. So
ArtPrize
in ArtPrize 10 is $500,000 in prizes, but we gave out I think $270,000 in grants.
Yeah.
Before the event.
And by grants, you mean this is money for you to prepare the project entry,
money to
create art to compete for ArtPrize.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah,
Just
money
clarify.
money for upfront in the preparation of ArtPrize, money to artists, but also venue curators.
And that had a thread and a
educators.
line through, from year one, and sort of like hearing concerns of artists.
Yeah, totally.
Through that. And,
Yeah.
you can, it's been this meanderable, malleable, very format
Yeah.
that has listened. But you've been really the point person for ingesting that information,
Yeah.
bringing it to other leadership and people that could decide, what are the next steps? How do we improve? How
Yeah.
do we do it?
Well, and because there's a difference between how you begin an organization and how you sustain it.
Yeah.
Right. And that's, and people talk about startups or whatever, and it was sort of a startup, but we're a nonprofit. And so it's a different calculus there. But we started in a very unusual way for a nonprofit, which was that we did not start small, and we didn't build up a base of, volunteers and supporters and an all volunteer working board like a lot of small nonprofits do. We just came out of the gate like we're already huge and this is what we're doing. And then we had to kind of backfill the sorts of support that is normally a part of the infrastructure for a budding nonprofit. But either way, to go from starting an idea, like here's this crazy bold idea, to sustaining it, it's a very different conversation. And so that's really the transition that has happened over the past 10 years. And one of the things that I think is this kind of undertold story, which is, bugs me a little bit about it, is that one of the things that we've worked so hard to do over the last decade is to broaden our base of support. Mm-hmm. And so now it's an incredibly broadly supported nonprofit where, the largest chunk, but still only a little over half, is from a whole bunch of corporate sponsors.
Yeah.
So we have 3 full-time people that just do nothing but just raise money all the time because we what we do takes a lot of money to produce, and of course we give out a lot of money either in grants or project years or prizes. And so I think that the kind of initial splash that we made, there's still this persistent misperception that it's they just have this pile of money and they can do whatever they want with it. And it's it's not true at all. I spend so much of my time agonizing over budgets and just raising money and raising money and raising money. And it means getting a very broad base of people, from individuals to corporations to foundations, believing in what you're doing and believing in the value of it, and it's grounding.
Well, and the organization's had a lot of, I've seen some things I'm not on the inside, but I've definitely seen, I work with a lot of internal people there to produce what we do every year, or I do for ArtPrize every year. But there's been changes. You've been really, again, I keep calling you the center point, but of this institutional knowledge, there's been 4 or 5 executive directors have circulated through, and
I'm not the executive director now, to be clear.
No.
Jory Bennett. I do have a boss. I don't just get to do whatever I want.
No, but
I'll take your praise, but I do want to.
No, but you've been at that point, which really was the point for the public to sort of react to, artists to come to with their concerns. That was you. So that's different than being in the back rooms and sort of shaking hands and making, trying to sell the idea of ArtPrize as a sponsorship or underwriting opportunity. But that I can't imagine. Again, I'll get off the compliments, but ArtPrize without sort of you being that steady person in that role, I can't think of it someone, especially because of how you've executed it. But in the rearview mirror, I don't really know how, if there'd been somebody a little more combative and explosive and took a different tone with the public, it could have easily been not as successful and more misunderstood and all that stuff.
That's probably true.
Yeah.
And it's perennially misunderstood anyway. There's something about ArtPrize as kind of a troublemaker. As an institution.
It's a rabble-rouser.
A rabble-rouser thing
that's
always...
a Midwestern term, isn't it?
Probably.
We're a whippersnapper.
It always really appealed to me, and because as a art student long ago, learning about art history and learning about the avant-garde and different kind of weird experiments that people were trying, especially throughout the 20th century, those were always the people that I was that really stuck with me. Oh my gosh, you can do that.
Yeah.
I had this... there's this artist, Bruce Nauman, who I remember this art history professor I had said that Bruce Nauman is a gadfly. A gadfly is
a cool word.
It's like a tiny animal, but it bites the cow in the butt, and the cow moves. It has to move, right? He's just this instigator. And I think that Bruce Nauman is even more than that, and I think that there's a lot going on in his work. But there is an element of that that's really true, and I've always really admired that, and I've always thought why can't there be like museums that have a clear sort of centuries-long mission of the preservation of culture. But why can't there also be this ecosystem of other art organizations that are just like nimble and they're crazy and they're like, we have this nutso idea and we're going to do this and we're going to do
The
that.
art world's been a little, it's faster now because of organizations like ArtPrize, but they've been a little reluctant to release the reins of power and sort of like different thinking about art is, it's institutionally kind of protected that way.
Sure.
And it feels...
And in some ways it should be.
Yeah.
Because the preservation mission of museums is super important.
Yeah.
And we wouldn't know about Bruce Nauman if there weren't institutions preserving even the crazy stuff he did that's like hard to preserve because it's just like a weird videotape he made in 1978 or something.
Right.
And it's going to decay. But like, and so we need that. But I think that I'm interested in an art world that has a bunch of different experiments happening not only at the artist level but at the institution level, where there's institutions that are willing to be like, well, what if we tried this and what if we tried this?
Yeah.
And I think that's a sign of like a healthy thing. And it's because it's always seemed so weirdly incongruous to me where you have these institutions that support artists that are just knocking down barriers left and right, and they're just like nothing is sacred, and the artists are just like so bold in that way.
Yeah.
And then the people supporting them are like the most straight and narrow.
Yeah, for sure.
And they have one way of working.
Yes.
And I'm like, did you learn anything from these artists that you venerate so that like their whole thing is about like
they're
this
basically
kind of like kill your
flipping
idols
the bird
approach.
to everybody and everything that's in power, right?
Right.
Like so much of art is reacting to constraints and power structures and wealth and any kind of hoarding of ideas or culture or whatever it might be.
And one thing, and I was going to make this point earlier, and I'll say it now, is that when people criticized ArtPrize when it started with the public vote, like, well, why does the public get to choose? They were kind of misunderstanding what the vote was for. The vote has never been for determining the best artwork. It doesn't really do that.
Yeah.
It's more of, it's like an engagement tool. It's just this kind of red herring to get people to show up, and then once you're there, people can be involved in art in different ways. But but one thing I will say in defense of the public vote is that I think it's exciting to have something that's market-like but has nothing to do with money.
Yeah.
Because so much of the art world, and this is a little less true in Michigan because we don't have a huge collector culture, but if you're talking about bigger art centers...
Tell me about it. I used to own an art gallery, dude.
Totally.
There's no collecting culture.
Yes. But if you're talking about bigger art centers where all this activity is taking place, and even the cutting-edge stuff that I am more drawn to, the core of it is the market. That's so much of what it is. It's just this obscene market, and there's so many people involved in it that collect for no other reason than just kind of vanity for themselves and just kind of this like I have a bunch of yachts and mansions and I just need baubles to put around.
Right.
And which people rightfully are like get really tired of that, and people who are in art for different reasons get really annoyed by that. So I do love the thing I love about
there's limited access to that type of success, right?
Yeah.
Too. I mean, there's so few channels. It's like saying you want to be a movie star.
Yeah.
Or to be like a top 50
Totally.
globals actor or actress. You know, it's such rarefied air. It just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah,
to
well,
people.
and
it discounts, all these people who are talented but just haven't found the right stroke of luck.
Well, yeah, and the activity of tracking all of that is something that it's like that's. I don't know. It's adjacent to art, but it's not really what it's about.
Yeah.
But there's something I think is interesting about this broad question of like, well, what's good and what has value and what doesn't, and like, what do you like? Who's your horse to bet on? Kind of a thing,
Right.
and happening, which is a little market-like.
Yeah, I like
in
that.
in the public vote, which just doesn't have anything to do with money. Like we're not
early
asking
on
anyone
every
for
art
money.
prize. There's just there's the buzz, and I used to produce the what we would call internally kind of a hype video to like give people a preview, an energetic preview of like what art prize looks like this year.
Yeah.
And I don't know, everybody, a lot of friends and family and people I didn't know on Facebook would be like, what do you like at ArtPrize? What's great? What's this? And that sort of, it's pretty amazing, I think, too, how quickly things sort of organize that support and popularity around those 10 or 15 or 30 items that get a lot of conversation right out of the gate.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's predictable, and sometimes it isn't. It's just been an interesting. Someone should do a whole thesis on what art got selected, the norms of the day, politically, and socially, economically, what was happening, what people wrote about, or would they write a mini? There's a lot underneath
Yeah.
that curtain
Well, and now that it's we're
about
getting,
us. I mean, it
Yeah,
really is a
totally.
reflection of us, and
And we're
that's
getting
been-
further from some of those early years. You could start to see some of that more clearly.
Yeah.
And social media is of course a big part of ArtPrize, but honestly, a lot of what happens with ArtPrize, I think, is driven by local media. And
which you've
obviously,
embraced with, you have a huge relationship with Wood TV.
Yeah, totally.
They
And
do live broadcasts.
we do usually
artists or
four.
curators
Yeah,
talk
we
about
do
art.
like 4 live broadcasts during a typical ArtPrize, and so we've really leaned into that. But even in the 10 years of ArtPrize so far, things like the Grand Press and MLive have changed radically. Like who they have on staff to cover that kind of thing, and
Everything's upside down.
and it's crazy and it's sad in a lot of ways. And I've seen good people lose their jobs and things, but it's a kind of an industry in turmoil in certain ways. But the way that the entire event is processed, and even like the way that we do our jobs, the media landscape has a direct effect on it. It really does. And there's because there was this thing where in the early years it was like, we'd be like, oh, there's 1,262 artists this year, and then we get an email the day later, and the press would run with it, whatever. We get an email a day later, and there'd be some like very convincing sob story. This artist like, oh, my computer crashed, and won't you let me in? And and we look around and we'd be like, yeah, why not? Let's just be nice. But then we were like, it's going to be a story. Like the press is going to like be like, why did the number change? And then they would do like a whole thing on it.
Sure, yeah.
And they would, and we would have to be like, oh man, like they're going to think it's corrupt, or they're going to like they would be on it.
Yeah.
Lately, they will not notice.
Yeah.
Like and now it's good because we can be nice and we can be like, hey, there was a deadline. Shit happens, man. I get it. Like, yeah, sure, you're in. Like.
Right.
No biggie, right?
Yeah.
There's a certain point where we have to stop doing that, but we can do that a little bit
for sure.
But it's
I'd like
weird
to
because
enter last year's competition, but it's okay.
Sure, you want to win? No, but it's like this. It's a small thing, and you wouldn't think about just sort of how many people are employed at the arts desk, like having an impact like that. But it like has a very concrete impact on how we're actually able to operate.
Yeah.
And for people who aren't let in after the deadline, it makes a huge deal because whatever.
Yeah. I think there's a couple things I want to transition to. One is I want to make sure that we. There's a few instances throughout the 10 years of ArtPrize, and this isn't like a whole retrospective show, but there's been a lot of cultural narratives happening within artworks and people pushing buttons, and which even talks about up until today. So let's talk about Project One.
Yeah.
And then I want to timestamp this, but we'll explain what Project One is. But right now there's developing information around a very controversial.
Everything's changing quickly. So
everything's changing. So I'll explain what that is later. But so there's 10 years of ArtPrize. It's adapted, it's moved, it's bobbed and weaved into what it was for 10 years. And then the decision was made to make it biennial. Mm-hmm. And then the in-between year, which we are now, is Project One. And this is this commission-based where several artists are given enough money to do something on a very grand scale that they could not afford to do themselves. And they're chosen under the umbrella of a theme this year. Mm-hmm. So explain a little bit about the theme, Project One, and
Yeah, so the theme is Crossed Lines. So the exhibition of Project One really has a title, which is Crossed Lines, which we've never been able to do with ArtPrize before, because you mentioned a second ago that a lot of themes pop up in works within ArtPrize, and you can even look back and be like, why was this a big year for dragons or motorcycles or something? It's like, or like the 10th anniversary of 9/11, and there's like stuff that happens in ArtPrize that year. But for the most part, ArtPrize is everything in the kitchen sink. It's this huge smorgasbord. You can never narrow it down.
And
we've never really tried
steampunk as anything could be steampunked without being steampunk.
Right?
Like
but
even
if you can trend spot, it's like even then you're pulling out 1% to 2% of overall entries.
Yeah.
And weaving them together, there's never anything overall, which is great because that's what ArtPrize is meant to be.
I just meant steampunk as just a amazing sort of cobbling it together of all kinds of different things to make something else, and that's what ArtPrize is at its as central sort of
I see.
theme.
You're saying steampunk as like a metaphor.
I don't mean literally. It's
well, there
all
was definitely literally a time where there was more like steampunk creators than there are now. I feel like that moment has passed, Brian.
Yeah.
So.
Well, you go your way, I'll go mine.
Okay? Are you welding steampunk ray guns in your basement?
I've been salvaging in junkyards for the last. I found a bumper on an old Buick, and I just can't wait to figure it out to be like a bow and arrow of like some Greek eagle.
Yes. With like little gears and
lots
knobs,
of gears, a
knobs
lot of
on
little bolts.
Yep. Some vacuum tubes. So we one of the things that we realized that we could do if we were commissioning these big public art projects, which are just too large and too complex to exist within the ArtPrize format, but it's the kind of work that really feels like it's what we should be supporting, and it's an extension in many ways of the ethos of ArtPrize, because these projects that we've commissioned are participatory in their own way, and are public facing. And involve the public in a way that's really exciting. And so, with ArtPrize, there's this kind of overarching question, which is, or like a call to action to the audience, which is to vote. And it's like there's the implicit question in the entire experience is like, who do you think should get this money?
Yeah.
And whether you actually vote or not, this is my theory, whether you vote or not, I think that that implicit overriding question colors the experience.
Yeah.
And so even if you just like go check it out, you don't vote, you maybe watch the news later and they're saying like, here's the finalists or whatever. It's still like the narrative is there. Kind of like where if a sports competition is happening, or the finals, NBA finals are happening, and you don't care about any of the teams, but it's like the narrative is still there, and that's how you're following it.
Right.
And politics is the same way. And so I think that what's exciting for us is that with this project 1 and with the project 2 and 3 that we'll do in future years, we get to talk to artists really early on in the process, and ask them, what do we do with this audience? Like for every one of these projects, it was this question really early on of not only what do people see when they show up, but what do they do?
Yeah.
It's about activity. And so for some of these things, that a lot of that involvement and interaction has been happening in the run-up to the exhibition, like in the case of Amanda Browder's work, where she's creating these enormous fabric textile pieces that will wrap around buildings. And those are generated from donated fabric and volunteer sewing days, which we've been running since like April. And just hundreds and hundreds of hours of
Before you go into a little more of the artist, I just want to reboot back. So ArtPrize never had a curatorial window or theme to look at art through. And you selected cross lines. Was it blurred lines?
Cross lines.
Blurred lines was
blurred lines is Robin Thicke.
We should license that song. Yes, for the next thing. But so cross lines. So you came. I think was that you kind of came up with this idea.
I did.
As like here's the initial sort of filter that we can start to.
Yeah.
Maybe filter is the wrong word, but
I think
the optics are going to be how does art relate around these crossed lines and boundaries within the city of Grand Rapids?
Yeah, so cross lines in a because I haven't said what that means yet. You're right. So cross lines is an exhibition about the lines that unite and divide a city. Some of them are visible, some of them are invisible, but they have a tremendous sway on how the built environment is navigated by people, and they have an effect on how we feel like we do or don't belong.
Right.
And so
it's about belonging.
It's about belonging, and on the other side of that, it's about alienation, and what's the difference between belonging and alienation.
Yeah.
And so that was born out of conversations we had with people like Scott Welch. I don't know if you know Scott Welch.
Yeah, no, Scott.
About we were talking with him early on in this process, and he was like, there's a huge difference between welcoming and belonging.
Right.
And he's like, we're talking about Grand Rapids and this, and having mixed feelings about our hometown, and this is something he says about Grand Rapids, if I can paraphrase him, which is that Grand Rapids is really good at welcoming and not very good at belonging.
Yeah.
Which is that we're happy to say like, oh, hey, you're welcome here, and do the like booster thing and be nice and all that stuff, but there's a much deeper sense of like, where do you belong?
Yeah.
And where has your presence been anticipated before you showed up, right? And what's a space that feels like it's for
this
you?
gets to the root of a lot of issues in many cities, but in Grand Rapids specifically is these deeply rooted historical systems which have created these boundaries and reinforced them, visible and invisible, either whether they're economic, racial, or just the geographic barriers of roads and rivers and things that you talked about.
Absolutely, and Grand Rapids has a deep history of this kind of thing, and Grand Rapids is not alone. There's one of many cities that have a history of redlining, which is a sort of discriminatory housing practice, where the deeds of properties would say that it had to be white people only that could buy these houses, and the thing about that I think a lot of white people like me aren't aware of, and that I wasn't aware of until a few years ago when I looked into it more, is that simply making those housing practices illegal, like technically illegal, is only the first step, and if that, not much of a first step in erasing the long.
And even recently, there's been banks, local banks, that have been really called out and flagged and fined for loaning practices within. The data's there. If people just look at it, that it's predatory and the interest rates are terrible, or you just cannot get a loan. Like their portfolios do not represent. Anyway, so yes, but it continues, even though yes, there's been but I think desegregation for a long time.
So the idea though of doing an exhibition where we invite artists to think critically about the lines that divide the built environment, that came out of partly an acknowledgement of the history of this place, which is it's a river city, so we have like this east and west of the river kind of a thing. There's the 131, cut downtown in half at a certain point in our history, and the fortunes of the two halves of that division were very different. And even now, it's like the west side is kind of coming up now, but that's it's like they're only
took another 50, 60 years.
Yeah, only like decades behind in terms of what happened on the east side of that highway. So, and there's tons of stuff like that, and there's a lot that we don't know. I'm not by any means a big expert in this kind of thing, but I think that art is a way that we can dig into those things. And there are local artists in Project One, but the majority of them, there are 5 artists, and 4 of them are not from the city. And part of the idea with that is that I think that people can come in with fresh eyes and bring work that connects local issues, local struggles, local histories to a broader national and global context. And I just think that that's something that art is very good at doing, and so that was always really important to me. But also, part of the Cross Lines thing came out of a critical reflection on ArtPrize itself, because part of what we did the first year, which was kind of a fateful decision, and we've been kind of dealing with the consequences of it ever since, was that we made an ArtPrize district. It wasn't just it wasn't just any space in Grand Rapids could be a venue to host artists. We just drew this box. And placed it over the map of downtown Grand Rapids, which was like Leonard to the north and Wellesley to the south.
In its practical application, it was like we need to limit the geographic space that art is in, so people can find it and venues can participate. And you couldn't have a 50 square mile district. It would never work.
It wouldn't be one event.
But there were these same kind of ramifications that, like, once you put a boundary around, then you've decided what to include and exclude.
Yeah, by default. And one thing that we didn't, of kind of a vector of the way that the city is already subdivided that we weren't considering when we did that, I can fully admit, is the city of Grand Rapids is divided into 3 wards.
Yeah.
And the first ward and the second ward kind of meet in downtown, and so if you place a box on downtown, which is what we did, you get about half of its first ward, about half of its second ward. Those wards are much bigger, the majority of all of them are
they just
out,
drew a little part that,
But the ArtPrize boundaries don't include the third ward at all.
Yeah.
And and that wasn't our intent, and like I said, it wasn't a part of the frame that we were looking at. But this, of course, was not the first time the third ward has been overlooked.
Well, the third ward is, just to be fully transparent, is economically challenged. It's the most diverse racially of our 3 wards.
Yeah.
And there's been a lot of not avoidance, but just there aren't the same catalysts for investment and credits, and that was a big report that came out recently too. Just how much money has gone to estate money and city money and Senate money has almost, laughably excluded the third ward.
Yeah.
This doesn't happen by accident. I'm not saying it's intentional.
No, but that's part of the, and that goes back to the conversation about redlining and discriminatory housing practices and things like that, because so even if, and there's a lot of argument about this, but even if you were to be generous and you were to say that the kind of racist intent of those discriminatory housing practices was something that happened earlier in the 20th century, even if you were, which I think is pretty naive, but even if you thought we were past that, the legacy of it that carries on is incredibly powerful, and
it's still an open wound, and it still bleeds, and it hasn't, it's still. And
I tend to think, and I tend to think that it's more than just an historic wound that hasn't healed. I think it's actively continuing, just through different means. Yeah. But that's kind of another thing to get into. But yeah. So we were thinking about that. So part of the thing that we were able to do with the approach to Project One as compared to ArtPrize is that we didn't need to have a just sort of one size fits all, just throw a box at the map.
Right.
Instead, we talked to artists, we talked to the city, we talked to community leaders, we talked to neighborhood associations, because we gave ourselves a lot of time to plan this, and we were like, what do we want to do and where does it work? And we brought artists in for site visits, and we told them about the city, and we just talked it through. And then we also landed on this thing of it's in 3 different locations. Project One is downtown, on the west side at Tanglefoot, and on the southeast side at MLK Park, and that ends up being in all 3 wards.
Yeah.
So it was, and which is a little bit symbolic, because this is part of what we're talking about as we talk about how the whole project came together. But it's, but it really, it came out of, I think, in a way, looking critically even at what ArtPrize is itself, which I think is a little, and that goes back to the idea of like how different art institutions can operate, because I'm interested in an art institution that can look at itself critically, rather than one that's just kind of like, we're the best, everything we do is super great.
And just to tie that up, you tied it up nicely, but that's been, I think, even though people don't necessarily perceive it in real time, ArtPrize has been doing since day one. Like it's been critical of itself, in a way to learn, not to learn and adapt. And its founder, visionary, is someone who is a catalyst for failing quickly and trying lots of things and not worrying about, too much about one particular consequence of a single, decision. Like, so in that DNA, I think it's done a good job, but now you're able to intentionally, as a critical reaction now with Project One, to incorporate crossing those lines, as the theme says, is like we're going to intentionally make a throughway through these borders, symbolically, artistically, even geographically. You're like, you've ticked some different boxes off this time in reaction to what you've learned for 10 years.
Yeah, do you mean like a checklist, or making the boxes mad? You've ticked off.
No. I mean, as a to-do list of well, we are going to address these particular things.
It's an imperfect process, and it's not something that I think that it's not something that you can ever get fully right. No, but I think that art is a good way of thinking out loud.
Well, even if it's at its base, at its most simple execution, it will get hundreds of thousands of people to move in different parts of the city that they don't normally traffic through. It's mostly through commute and practicality that you take whatever route it is to wherever you're going. But this is a deviation for you're creating a destination to a place that you might not have seen or even experienced one time, or been to a restaurant there, or walked down the street and felt safe or unsafe, or whatever it might be. I think that it just by that collision and intertwining of people moving throughout the borders that they don't normally cross will have some impact that will be overwhelmingly positive in just broadening people's perceptions of their own community. And hopefully, for me, it would have that their community is much larger than they thought, in its diversity and people and commonality as well. In that, and they can see for themselves, because I'm as guilty as anyone else that takes a particular route, and you have a routine, and You really have to be intentional, and most people don't really think it with that intentionality around who they know, who they interact with, who they socialize. It seems to
Yeah.
be more accidental of where they live and work.
Yeah.
And ArtPrize has been an intentional, and Project One especially now, being more intentional about creating the intentionality of going to other places
Yeah.
you wouldn't normally go.
Well, yeah, and I think that's something that's changed in the city over the last 10 years is that when we started out in 2009, for a lot of our audience, that was a big leap just to go downtown.
Yeah.
Like they didn't really do that.
Yeah.
Or maybe fireworks or maybe the Biennial Arena for something here and there. But
Yeah.
for the most part, people like a lot, and some people think this sounds crazy, especially now, but there's just a lot of people that lived in the broader community that just wouldn't go downtown.
Mm-hmm.
And I think ArtPrize was a part of helping to break that down and show that there's a lot going on and whatever else. But there's also this sense, and this feedback that we're getting from the city as well, that like that's great, but there's other parts of the city, that want in on that action, and that's part of the thing of how MLK Park came up, is that was something that community members had already surfaced. Like we want more art and cool stuff in our park,
Yeah.
and it's a lovely park. So it's like,
It's a great park.
as we
it's
were
right by our houses, really.
yeah.
I mean,
As we were
it's-
looking around for
it's
sites,
overlooked.
that really bubbled up in that way.
I don't mean that we live next to each other or with each other, but we don't live too far from one another. But
It's true.
well, how so? To Scott Welch's point, in a broader picture, not that Project One is a catalyst, but how have you talked about and conceptualized the idea of belonging, either through the artists you've selected?
Mm-hmm.
I can think of one in particular about, especially with Site Lab and the disart conversation,
Yeah.
which is, why don't you explain what disart is this
Yeah,
year?
so this the question of belonging and what lines are we talking about crossing here, like that, I think that plays out differently with each artist, and that's the hope, that's the point,
the
is
beauty
that
of it.
is that it starts in a certain set of ideas and kind of moves out in a bunch of different directions, and they can overlap in kind of exciting ways that weren't expected. So one of the commissioned artists, I say one, but it's actually two people, but they're acting as a collaborative, as a collective, is Paul Amenta and Ted Lott. And Paul Amenta is somebody that people might know because he's the co-founder and really the chief animator of Site Lab. And Site Lab has done all sorts of really incredible ArtPrize venues through the years, but they do a lot more than that. And Site Lab is an all-volunteer-run, nomadic contemporary art exhibition producing nonprofit, and they do these incredible installations, temporary installations in non-art spaces. Mm-hmm. So those are usually kind of buildings in transition, but they've also done things at like Blandford Nature Center and all kinds of cool stuff. Ted Lott is an architect who's done a lot of wonderful projects around the city, including a bunch that are going right now with Lot 3 Met's architects, and is somebody who's really thinking a lot about architecture
And space and how people interact with urban environments.
and city building.
And mobility and
yeah.
Transportation.
At a bunch of different levels, and he's so they've partnered together before, and this is not their first time they worked together. So they're producing a piece called Critical Infrastructure, which is going to be installed primarily on the exterior, but in a kind of partial courtyard space at the Tanglefoot building, which is a really interesting, very old industrial campus, which has held artist studios for a very long time. So people may have gone to art events at Tanglefoot sometime in the last 3 decades because there's been artist studios there for a long time. But this will be not in those studios, it'll be a build out kind of on the rear of the building. And what they're doing is they're building this series of ramps, stages, platforms, catwalks, this kind of like theater in the round thing that's like half globe theater, half minimalist sculpture. And then it's really meant to be a stage and a frame for other creative activity. So the broader Site Lab volunteer organization is involved in helping program out a really phenomenal series of events in the space, and then they're also partnering really closely with disart. And disart is another local nonprofit who ArtPrize has worked with before. They curated and produced the ArtPrize exhibition at Meyer Gardens last year. If you saw that, really phenomenal show. But disart is an organization that's committed to advancing a disabled culture and using the arts to advocate for people with disabilities and disability as a cultural identity. So they've done all sorts of consulting and programming and exhibitions over the past 5 years or so that are really exciting. And so they're thinking also about a lot about access, physical access to a space, and so they're taking this kind of rough, just sort of nasty courtyard space, which is hard to even walk through, let alone roll through if you're in a chair, and creating it into this accessible environment where these different elevations and things can be reached by people with all different types of mobility. So they're working closely with DisArt on that, and then DisArt is also doing a lot of the programming. And so for our opening day, DisArt is working to program some stuff there for the evening, and then another day later in the exhibition, which is September 28, DisArt is taking over the space again to program a whole day and evening of a bunch of other stuff.
Yeah, and we may or may not delve into the current controversy that's moving very quickly right now with one of the programs within the DisArt initiative at Site Lab for this project. But let's talk a little bit about the four other artists in 3 different sites.
Yeah.
So one's at Tanglefoot, that's Site Lab, and DisArt.
Yeah, so at Tanglefoot is also a piece by Amanda Browder, who I mentioned earlier, who is
fabric.
Yeah, who's doing these fabric installations where she's collecting donated fabric, working with volunteers to create these enormous striped textile pieces, which are soft and colorful, but also architectural in scale, and they envelop these buildings. And so she'll be doing a kind of a wall-hanging piece at Tanglefoot. The biggest single piece she's doing is at MLK Park, which wraps the lodge building that's in the middle of the park. And then she's also wrapping several of
the lodge is kind of the building that is near the pool area.
Next to the
kind
pool.
of multi-part, and there's that.
It's like a multi-purpose room. It used to be a boxing gym. It's no longer a boxing gym.
The GR box isn't there anymore.
The ring is still inside, but the organization is not currently using it. But it's a multi-purpose space, and there's dance classes and things held in there. But part of the reason that folks from the community were interested in artists activating the park in that space is they're trying to figure out what to do with the building. Like, the building has a lot of potential. And I think that temporary public art can be this great way of coming in
to probe ideas, and there's
not
limited. You're not committing to the next 15 years of a building's
and
use.
we can't keep the fabric up, even if that's what people would want, because it starts to discolor and it won't last forever. But it's a great way to draw attention to a space and to think about it. And then Amanda Browder is also wrapping several of the segments of the Skywalk downtown that connects several parking garages and hotels, like over Pearl and Lewis and those streets. And so several of those segments will be wrapped in these fabric installations. So she's at all 3 sites. Amanda's the only artist whose multi-sited project is at all 3 of those Project One locations. MLK Park also has a sculpture by Heather Hart. She's an artist from New York who creates these really large sculptures that look like the rooftop of a single-family home. That's kind of like the home is sunk into the ground to the point where only the roof emerges. And these roofs can be climbed on, and they can also function as stages for unique performances. And so we'll be programming that several times.
I don't want you to speak for her, or a thesis, what sort of conceptually, or what is that a metaphor for, kind of as a
Well, she's thinking about it
snapshot?
in a couple different ways. She calls these the one this one is called the Oracle of the Soulmates, and there's 2 rooftops. So there's one in MLK Park, and there'll be one in Rosa Parks Circle downtown, and they'll be identical. But so these identical kind of twin rooftops in different parts of the city. And so she's kind of thinking about this, the sort of connection and the dislocation. It's in the same city, but the distance and what surrounds these identical artworks is, of course, very different.
And I'll bet people will interact differently to some degree. And even though the structures themselves are identical in size and scale and material.
Yeah. But she calls them oracles, and the other similar rooftop pieces that she's done elsewhere, she also calls oracles. And she's thinking a lot about like an oracle as a site that you can kind of travel to for insight, maybe insight into yourself or to seek truth. But also oracle in the sense of oral tradition, because she's very interested in the way that things like carpentry and like house building is an oral tradition. And the design of these houses is actually based on the design of the house that she grew up in. Oh, wow. And I think her father or grandfather was a carpenter. And so there's like this sense of kind of the oral tradition of building. But then also there's this sort of, scream from the rooftops kind of idea with it, where you're invited to go up there and to sing and to speak and to claim space.
That's awesome.
So who else did that? Oh, yeah. So then also Rafael Lozano Hemmer is a Mexican-Canadian artist who does a lot of incredible installations that employ technology and use light and sound and sometimes like water vapor and video and all sorts of cool stuff. And he is doing a project on the Blue Bridge called Voice Bridge, which will have, I think it's like 400 spotlights installed near the surface of the footpath of the bridge.
Yeah.
And then these speakers as well along the handrails. And participants will be able to record short messages through an intercom, and then those messages play back through the speakers and modulate the lights with the voices of the participants.
Interesting.
And then so those, and the more that get recorded, they get like moved down these stations of lights across the bridge until it gets to the end, and then that message is deleted and lost forever. Wow. So there's this kind of like sending these messages across this divide of the river. And then the final artist is Olalekan Jefus, who's a Nigerian-born artist based in New York, who is trained as an architect, but is doing a lot in public art. And that piece is a large sculpture that takes kind of the form of a house and a building kind of stacked into one, sort of juxtaposing architectural forms of single-family houses and larger urban developments. And it's really born out of research about redlining and discriminatory housing practices that are a part of the history here and in a lot of other places as well.
Yeah. Well, I'll just ask you right out. Do you want to go into kind of the current sort of little bit of a storm that's happening? It's mostly a misunderstanding that's sort of taken flight.
Well, like you said, so what's today? August 21?
August 21, as of August 21,
and this
about 2:20 in the afternoon.
And I haven't checked my email in the last hour. Yeah, so stuff is moving really quickly with this. And so I'll back up a little bit. So Project 1 runs from September 7 to October 27, which is much longer than ArtPrize. That's one way in which the projects are much bigger and it's a much longer exhibition. So people are like, is it bigger or smaller than ArtPrize? And I'm like, in what way are you measuring? But what we're doing for the opening day on September 7 is we're doing programming at all three of those locations at different times of the day. So it's going to kick off at Rosa Parks Circle at noon. There's this really incredible dance performance called Bandaloop, which will be dancing and rappelling off of buildings downtown. Wow. And so dancing kind of in the sky.
Is this related to Rob Liss's paper airplanes at all? Are we using some of the same buildings, rappelling?
There probably will be some of the same buildings because those are the buildings that are down there. But it's not related in any way. So that'll be really great, and there'll be other stuff happening down there, and then it'll sort of shift to MLK Park for kind of a family celebration and artist panel discussions and performances on Heather Hart's roof, and of course seeing the lodge wrapped in fabric. And then the plan is for then things to then go to the Tanglefoot site in the evening for a panel discussion with those artists, and then a performance. Which was organized by Disart, this group called Drag Syndrome, which is a performance troupe from London, and this is slated to be their U.S. debut. They've never performed in the U.S. before. It's a kind of innovative dance and drag performance where the adult performers have Down syndrome. But they're incredible performers, and they're artists in their own right and really quite accomplished. And have gotten a lot of really great press in the UK, and they just did some things in Canada recently. So a few weeks ago, we announced that lineup because we're excited about all that programming. That first Saturday kicks off what will be a whole series of Saturdays. And so September 14th, there's a huge concert and performance on the Blue Bridge, which will activate Raphael Zonelhammer's Voice Bridge. On the 21st, September 21st, there's the African American Art and Music Festival, which will happen at MLK Park. There'll be performances on Heather Hart's roof, as well as a ton of other stuff happening. And then September 28th, back to Tanglefoot for an installation called Voices. Anyway, Drag Syndrome is meant to be the kind of capstone of that opening day. And it's something that we're really excited about. And it's one of those things where, even though I didn't program it, and it's really Disart's doing, and through the network that they've built globally of disability arts advocacy organizations is how they got connected with this group. I think it fits so perfectly with cross lines. And there's even a word play, which is like cross-dressing, cross lines.
Yeah.
And when I was thinking about cross lines, like I told you before, I'm thinking about cities, I'm thinking about redlining, I'm thinking about who feels like they belong downtown, who feels like they can go over this road, or which side of the river is yours, or, like all this kinds of stuff that affects how we feel like we belong or don't within a city. But I hadn't been thinking about expressions of gender. Right. I hadn't been thinking about sexuality, but it's perfect. It's totally perfect.
And disability this idea, within that context.
And disability as well. And of course, and Paul and Ted were, with the design and the intent of critical infrastructure as a structure, we're thinking about disability, especially in terms of mobility access, which is only one dimension of disability. But thinking about that very deliberately, and of course we were as well. But this idea of who gets to play, because drag is a very playful art form, right?
Sure.
Who gets to play with ideas of gender, and who gets to
express that art form?
Yeah.
And so some of the controversy within that context, at least the way I understand it, and I haven't looked at it deeply or broadly, but it was just that people were concerned that the drag performers were children with Down syndrome.
Yeah, which is a misconception, because they're not children.
Yeah.
They're adults, and they're on the spectrum of those things. They're very high functioning, and they're artists in their own right. And having talked with them directly about this exact question, their response is like, I can do what I want. Like it's a reclamation of agency, right? And I think that drag has that running through it, has that kind of sassiness kind of running through it as an art form anyway, and that's part of what these artists have really like embraced in it, which I think is really great. But I do think that so we've gotten a lot of emails, and like I said, this is the thing where it's all moving really fast in terms of how all this is developing, and it's fascinating. It's also distressing, because it doesn't have anything to do with children. The performers aren't children. We're not marketing it to children. There's just nothing in it is about children. But a lot of this negative feedback we're getting is focused on children, which is strange, because it's like it's
focused on children and disability, which is interesting. What I've seen has been the reactions to it have been horribly reductive in its analysis of it.
Yeah.
But also at the same time had a fantastic milieu of like misinformation and outright like things that aren't true.
I'd say fantastic. I mean,
I meant by an exorbitant amount of misinformation.
Right. Well, and I think that on the one hand, there are people who have questions about agency.
Yeah.
Right. And they want to make sure that no one's being like exploited or sort of put in a position that would be harmful or unsafe or something, and those concerns are valid, and we have and will continue to address those, and so is DisArt. But then there's this other end of the spectrum, which is just really vile homophobia, transphobia, and ableism, and it's really tricky, because if people have legitimate concerns, you don't want to lump them in with like literal hate groups.
Yeah, you can parcel out the difference between the two. But,
it's a tough thing to message. But at the same time, when I can take a moment to step back a little bit, I'm like, this is kind of what this thing is about. Like, where are these fault lines? Like, where are the lines that we think we can't cross? And I get that some of those like invisible lines. I'm not trying to, and DisArt is not trying. If I can speak on their behalf, which I try not to do, but in terms of ArtPrize as being a supporter of this and including it in a large constellation of programming, we're not trying to be deliberately controversial. We're not trying to kick a hornet's nest, and that's never the intent
of provocative around intentionally provocative around these issues.
No, not at all. And DisArt's planning process, to their credit, is really meticulous, and the kind of the conversations that go into making sure that they're doing this right. They're really good at that. Yeah. So it's a little disheartening to see people misconstrue it, and it's it starts to verge into people. It's like they think that they're defending something, but they're really taking away the agency and the voice of artists.
We'll be releasing this podcast a few days before this. There's at least a week and a half before anyone will hear this.
Yeah, so
a lot
again,
can happen there. A lot can be out the other side.
August 21. This is a mini time capsule of how I'm processing things right at this moment. But we'll see where everything lands.
So, but again, you're the tip of the spear for some of these things. I mean, you didn't organize or program it. You gave a platform to.
No, I didn't. But one thing I will say to that though is that what I did program and what I commissioned and what I as a curator, what I the reason I selected Paul, Amenta, and Ted Lott to create this project is because I like what they're doing, which is they are creating both a literal and a metaphorical infrastructure for the creativity of others.
Yeah.
And so as artists, and this is unusual because we think of artists as like, I'm this genius and praise me because I'm an artist, right. I'm so talented. Their kind of art is really meant to reverse that and to sort of like do the work to provide the infrastructure and then to decenter themselves from it, right? And that's the thing, that's like the conceptual core of what Paul and Ted are doing. It relates very much to what Heather Hart's doing of creating this roof. She designs it, but then she's like other people are climbing on it, right? And they just do things. And Raphael Lozano Hemmer, it's like he gives you the microphone. What do you say? Right. Are you going to say "I love you, mom"? Or are you going to say a swear word? Or are you going to what do you? He doesn't know. We don't know. Yeah. Like that's part of the thing of it. And even Amanda Browder with like she wants people to touch the work and like make it with your hands. And there's something that's so empowering about that. And so that's what we're doing. That's what ArtPrize is doing. That's what Project One is doing. That's what I'm doing as a curator. Is investing in these artists to create that space. That approach has a certain chaotic nature to it, which we're seeing play out because they as per the what they're creating, they handed the reins over to collaborators to help program it, and that's what sometimes it brings heat.
Well, and then it becomes about the public discussion again, the discussion of art, and that's what ArtPrize has always done really well from the beginning, and sort of being the catalyst for these conversations that help us learn. In the rearview mirror, they seem less intense and less like there was less at stake at the time.
Right.
In the in the real time experience, it was a lot of stakes and seemed to be a very intense experience. So I'm talking about the various years of ArtPrize. There's always something that sort of can pop up and really create a lot of discourse and create dialogue that sometimes isn't helpful, but other times, ultimately, I always think it is helpful, even if in the meantime it's a bit of a chaotic experience like you're having now. So anyway, not to be too abstract about it or anything, but we don't really know. It's so early. It just really popped up yesterday, I think.
Last couple of days,
which is 100 years in internet time.
I know.
It spreads like wildfire.
I know. People, in a week, people could be like, what? I don't know. It's kind of par for the course, and we're just, we're trying to do right by artists and do right by everybody else. So
I'll wrap up with a couple quick questions about you and your passion for curation and being this sort of, I don't know how to best describe that. I was going to call you kind of I don't even have the right metaphor, Kevin. I'm sorry, but it's like something about you're kind of for me. It's probably the wrong one. A canary in the coal mine for me in terms of dead. Like what's happening in the art world. What's your favorite part about being a curator? And maybe it's connected to being part of ArtPrize, and maybe it isn't about. But is there something abstractly that you could apply as a curator and your own artistic practice and approach to art that really pushes all the right buttons for you professionally and creatively and conceptually? Is just talk about being a curator.
Well, I called myself that a minute ago, so I have to own it. But it's a relatively new thing for me, and it's not my title. Colleagues of mine in other organizations, that is their title. That's not my title as artistic director, which is I am a curator, but it's my role shifts quite a lot from the project commission format versus the ArtPrize competition format. And so, we're already preparing for ArtPrize 2020, and that's partly why my title, which is relatively new, is artistic director, because I'm not going to be a curator in that context. That's more of an enabler of artists and also a design director in a sense for all of the kind of collateral that we do. which has a different kind of artistic element to it. But so the curator thing is a little new to me. But I'm just a big fan of.
Well, it's new to you as a practice to actually curate, but like your life has been impacted by curators and that role in its traditional definition. Your entire adult life,
absolutely,
in one way or another. So I don't know what my follow-up is to that, other than curation runs through your life a little bit more.
I'm a long-time wannabe curator who now gets to actually commission artists to do.
Well, that's a candid way to put it, because you're actually doing it in practice now through these 3 sites and 5 artists.
Yeah, and it's a deeply collaborative process. And even though I have kind of a soft spot for this curatorial turn or the curator as author of exhibition, and that's a sort of a complicated notion with the contemporary art. There's something I do kind of like about it, but going through it now, it's like every part of it is so collaborative. Like even the cross lines thing, I did come up with that, but it was in a conversation with a bunch of other people.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And so it's like, I don't know.
Well, that's just the idea. It's not that just starts the little snowflake becoming a snowball in terms of collaboration, because pretty soon then you're working with city entities and building owners, and like that whole, like it is, ArtPrize and Project One both are probably some of the most complicated collaborations that you could potentially have in the art world, for sure. At least, you know, just put the footprint out there. It's going to be complicated.
So, can I talk about who my curatorial hero is?
Yes.
So last year I got my master's degree in visual and critical studies from Kendall College of Art and Design here in Grand Rapids, and it's a new program. It's kind of an art theory program that they started just recently, and it focuses kind of on visual studies, but also art theory and visual theory. But for my thesis project and my master's thesis, I took more of a kind of a straight contemporary art approach, which was I wrote about this exhibition that happens once every 5 years in Germany called Documenta. Mm-hmm. And like you were talking about traveling to biennials and these big exhibitions, which I do get to do occasionally. I've been to Documenta twice in 2012 and 2017. And so I wrote about failure, 3 different failures in Documenta in 2012. And
failures from what perspective?
So the artistic director, the curator, Carolyn Christoph Bakirgev, one of them was the first failure was this artist named Kayatov, who was commissioned to create something for the exhibition and withdrew. And when he withdrew, he sent this very gushy kind of apologetic letter to the curator, and then the curator took that and displayed the letter. And so she just put a case and just was like, here's the letter of this guy who dropped out. And she put it in the first gallery of the main venue. So in the kind of normal way of viewing the exhibition, it's literally the first thing you saw was
so what was her
exhibition of failure.
I don't want to jump ahead of you. I apologize if I am, but so what was her curatorial power and reaction to that letter? Is she your hero? Is that who your hero is, or is it someone that, okay?
Yeah,
so,
no, she is. But she's a complicated figure.
Yeah.
Because whenever you research somebody that much, you learn how complicated they are. So that's one part of it. And then the other thing was
I know a lot of your complications.
There was these artists from Argentina who, as a kind of a ready-made artwork, they wanted to transport a meteorite from Argentina, this 37-ton meteorite called El Chaco. They wanted to put it on a barge and bring it to Germany and put it on a pedestal and just do nothing to it, just display it as an artwork. Mm-hmm. This just sort of moved mass, and then just bring it back when they were done.
Right.
And so the curator was really involved, and because the artist, it's just a conceptual gesture. It's like the artist and the curator, there's no distinction at that point. It's just all of them together are trying to get this to happen.
Yeah.
It failed. There was this local group of indigenous people who were this is part of the heritage of our region here in Argentina, and we don't want you to take it. And basically there was they were like, we know what happens when Europeans come here and take our treasures. They don't come back. We've been burned before.
We need to own that.
Yeah, totally. And so, but she not only did this project fail, she in her catalog essay that's the first thing she writes about. Like that's the first thing she talks about
Wow.
is the failure to bring El Chaco there. So
Right.
she like foregrounds the failure, just leans straight into it.
Yep.
And then the third thing is that there was this artwork that was installed in Castle in the city where Documenta was happening that had nothing to do with Documenta, but everyone thought it did because it was just very visible and very public. It was like this figurative sculpture in a church. And she tried to get it taken down. Like she tried to censor it, really, because she was just like, people think this is a part of my exhibition. It's not. I want you to take it down. And the church was like, no, this is our property.
This was
and
here
and-
before you.
No. It
came in before.
This is the problem
Yeah, sorry.
because it installed like right as it opened, right as Documenta opened, and so she failed. So the third thing is that she failed to censor someone else's artwork. And so anyway, so the whole thing was about these how you can like what are the limits of navigating failure and kind of like turning a failure into a success and kind of flipping it in that way, because she put up the letter and wrote about the absence of the meteorite became this big thing. It was like this sort of way to talk about the exhibition. But with the failure to censor the other work, she just doesn't talk about it.
Right.
she wasn't able to
So I love
bring
how
that
the
one into.
heroicism that you feel it was through her own sort of failures of curating something that wasn't it wasn't the intended outcome.
Yeah.
And so through
That's-
that,
yeah.
I mean, was there other brilliances that counterbalance her to say she's my hero, but she's the one that, or do you just mean symbolically you can make some horrible decisions, but also have this amazing sort of underside of...
I don't have time to get
Yeah.
into everything else, but the entire exhibition, the exhibition's huge, and
Yeah.
so these three things are just a small part of it.
Yeah.
Was really incredible, and even the way that she kind of played those failures, like the artworks that didn't arrive, the way that she kind of flipped them was in line. Like it helped her drive home the points that the entire exhibition was making.
Great.
You know what I mean? So it's
that
like,
was there underlied the brilliance
and so,
of that.
Exactly. And so there was a certain, and it sounds cheesy, but there's a certain kind of power in the absence
Yeah, sure.
of the meteorite that almost seemed
Yeah.
like you almost couldn't have planned it better. Like
Right.
like not getting it.
Imagine a meteorite on this pedestal.
Yeah, not getting it is almost kind of like, well, yeah, I don't know. Anyway, and that's how she positioned it. So there's something about the practical, like, I like it because no one's perfect. She's like, that's the most important exhibition probably in the world, and she's at the top of her game. But like, stuff just doesn't work
Right.
sometimes. So that gives me, I take
gives you-
I take solace in that.
Yeah,
but then
because
also
that happens to you to varying degrees almost every year in terms of something.
literally happening right now.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but then also the way that the frame of the exhibition and how you can talk about the exhibition can include that.
Yeah.
It's not all artifice. It's not all the show you put on. It's also what didn't make it.
Yeah.
And it's the work. It's the work to do it all, and all of it can be looked at critically, and all of it can be talked about. And I think that's cool.
Here's a segue. Well, I want to look at all the work at Project One this year. Let's see that Did you hear the segue?
Why would you want to?
No, I said here's a segue. Is that I certainly want to see all the artwork. Anyway, I even blew the segue. So
Oh no, I hear you.
This
now.
is my last podcast. And the first with Metro Health, the University of Michigan Health, and the last.
That's too
With,
bad.
it's
really too bad.
we were a brilliant comet that streaked across the sky.
I hope
and
you
then
learned
left.
something through that failure.
Well, thank you. I didn't even have time to get into stone polishing and gems and minerals and other
baking
things.
baking bread.
Bread last time, yeah.
The recording that none of you will hear. We talked about sourdough.
I'm going to have you back, and we're not
Yeah.
even going to talk about art. We're just going to talk about what you do polishing stones in your basement,
Yes.
and then this delicious bread I've never tasted.
Oh yeah, I should bring that in.
Yeah, I mean, that would engender you to a return visit, potentially.
I will.
Yeah.
I'll do it.
But no, you're someone I respect deeply. I've enjoyed working with you. We didn't even go into my own tooting horn of our 10-year retrospective video that I'm so proud of.
But everyone should watch it because it's amazing.
I'll put a link
I'll
up to
do
it
a quick horn toot for you.
Well, thank you. But anyway, I appreciate you coming back. I really, I said it in the first one that no one will ever hear because it's technically impossible to
It doesn't
decipher.
exist.
It does not exist. I'm going to put anyway, I was going to make a joke about the meteor being not there, and this is your first interview not being there. So it's kind of like that, and the absence creates longing. So we
absolutely.
all are pining for that first interview.
Absolutely.
But I really, honestly, and wholeheartedly really have respected you, watching you. I had the advantage of not working in the organization, but seeing how it's a unique sort of fly on the wall perspective I've had for 10 years internally and externally with the exhibition or with ArtPrize itself. So I'm excited about Project One and seeing what you're bringing. I love this curatorial muscle you get to flex now and to see where that goes, because I really just think you're one of the most interesting and a really needed voice in the art community to help the public continue to disseminate what art means for ourselves and for our community and for the world. So thanks again for popping back a second time.
Anytime.
All right, buddy. Take care.
This Full Exposure podcast episode has been made possible through the support of Metro Health, University of Michigan Health, and Dr. Peter Hahn, who believe that creativity and the arts are essential to a rich, healthy, and fulfilling life.